We continue, inshallah, with our journey into understanding the reliance of the worshiper and the skilled, meaning those who are devoted to a profession or those who want to elevate their status with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and they take their journey is Sayyidullah with seriousness. Before we enter into the first section of our text, the reliance or the support of the worshiper, we wanted to take some insights from what our journey should look like. And that insight, we take it from Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi with regard to his guidance on intention. And in Bidayatul Hidayah, or the initial stages of guidance, he writes some very important, or documents some very important insights with regard to the way of knowledge. And this is especially important when it comes to the issue of the study of Aqidah, because the study of Aqidah, for a good too many, instead of becoming a pathway to clarify one's thinking and thereby one's action in relationship to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, it becomes a fixation on identity and opposition. To delineate where I stand versus where you stand, as Dr. Akram Nadwi, the muhaddith from the UK, has noted, that many Aqidah texts are about demarcating positions. And that has its time and its place and its value. But Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi, he gives us some guidance, and he speaks to us, woe to the ignorant one. Because he, and we add she, did not seek knowledge, and woe 1,000 times to the knowledgeable one who did not act upon his, and we add, or her knowledge. Who did not act upon his knowledge. Understand, may Allah Most High have mercy on you, that there are three classes of people who seek knowledge. First is that person who seeks knowledge to make it his or her provision on the way to the next life, to the hereafter, and intends by that pursuit of knowledge to make it nothing other than the way to seek the face of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and to make as an aim the hereafter as your home. So then the pathway of knowledge for us is that it's supposed to better us in the process. That person he declares to be of the winners. That's the first person that takes the way of knowledge to be that means by which it's a provision, it supplies support, aid on the journey to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. The second is the human being who understands by seeking knowledge what? That it assists him in this world, to attain honor by it, good standing and wealth. And that person is aware of what he's doing in that process and feels in his heart that his state is not good and his intention is not right. That person puts themselves in jeopardy. If that person dies before tawbah, before making repentance, it must be feared that he will come to a bad end, and that person's fate is under the Mashiach of Allah, under the will of Allah. Whatever Allah decides in that person's standing. But if such a human being is divinely guided to repentance before the arrival of his appointed time, which he is death, and if he adds good works to his knowledge and redeems himself from his past shortcomings, he will become of the winners. For truly, the person who repents of a sin is like the one who has no sin. And then the third person is the one who has fallen completely under the influence of shaitan's sway. This person uses his or her knowledge only to increase his wealth, boast of his rank, and take pride in a large following. With this knowledge, he explores every avenue, hoping to gratify all the desires he has for this world. In spite of all this, he still secretly believes he has a high place with Allah, because he adorns himself with the outer characteristics of the learned, following in their footsteps in dress and in manner and speech, all the while rushing with frenzied desire towards the dunya, towards the world, inwardly and outwardly. This person is irretrievably lost. He is one of the foolish, deluded ones. This is because there's no hope for his repentance, as he is conceived that he is one of the ones who do good. Such a person is heedless of the words of Allah Most High. O you who believe, why do you say that which you do not do? Loathsome, most loathsome, or most disliked is it in the sight of Allah that you say what you do not do. He is one of those about whom the Messenger of Allah was speaking when he said, there are some that I fear more for you than I do the jihad. People asked, who are they, O Messenger of Allah? He said, evil scholars. This is Imam al-Ghazali's. I don't want to get into the whole issue about the hadith used, whether they're sound or unsound. Imam al-Ghazali is using certain principles to illustrate a certain point, and the point that he's illustrating is that the intention of the person has to be sound in order for them to be sound with Allah. That's clear. In addition is the utilization of knowledge for argumentation and the belittling of others, sectarianism, dividing the ummah, and so on and so forth. Not necessarily dividing the ummah from the angle of clarifying certain points and where there's differences of a belief, but dividing the ummah in the mannerisms that we do it by, the means that we take to correct or to clarify. Is it a means which demonstrates the highest level of wanting good for your brother and wanting to demonstrate the manners of the Quran and the prophetic example, or is it to prove oneself, to win the debate? Imam al-Ghazali gives us three pathways, and one of them clearly leads to the hellfire, and one of them is a shaky path. And in this, he's just talking about having a corrupt intention with regard to why it is that we pursue knowledge. If we add the dimension of today's time in which people utilize knowledge to argue with it and to label others and so on and so forth, without really desiring good for others, it's about proving oneself to be right and the other to be wrong, then we can add that as being a misguided pathway, a pathway which is not going to lead us to standing with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And one fears of our state in relation to Allah, where we end in that regard. If we, on top of that, are not looking at how to correct ourselves in the pathway of knowledge, and we're drowning in sin, and we're drowning in a disconnect between practicing our knowledge and speaking about it without good intention, then we're definitely in a wretched state in that regard. That's what we want to correct. We want to correct from ourselves these problems. And the reason why I preface this session with that discussion, or that reflection rather said, is because we're going into the section of the text which is dealing with usul ad-din. We're going into the section which deals with usul ad-din. And one of the characteristics of Shehu that I've learned along the way is that he wants the student to be in the process of self-reformation, because there's another level to the journey, which is to build the community. And the self-reformation piece, it has to have a collective component to it. It can't just be that I have my routine of talib ilm or seeking knowledge, and I have my routine of salah and dua and so on and so forth. But then in my interpersonal relationships with people, I don't seek to reform my relationship with them. And this is the difficulty we have. The level of family life, at the level of community life, our interpersonal relationships have issues. So Shehu, he focused on that social reform reality. In part, was foundational for any person that's active in community building is the spiritual dimension. In speaking to people that were activists in the past, one of the messages that I got was that there was a bankruptcy of spiritual grounding for a lot of activists, male and female. And that created a situation when people, they didn't have a foundation. And so that's something which has to be corrected within ourselves. Even just being part of the community in general, without having a reformationist or an Islahi approach, wanting to necessarily work on building the community just at the personal level and at the family level. If we're not focusing on this side, then we're going to drown, because the situation is such that the pathway of shaitan is multiplied. There's multiple pathways, and it's easy to fall into destruction. Easy to fall into destruction. So we have to take the issue serious of the way that we conduct ourselves, in our tongue, in our intentions, in our thinking, in our behavior overall. I remind myself and I remind you of that reality. He starts, rahmatullahi alayhi, may Allah benefit us by way of his knowledge in this world, benefit ourselves in him by way of his knowledge, rahmatullahi alayhi, in this world and in the hereafter. He starts with ilm usul ad-din. And we mentioned before, one of the things that he does is actually by way of other texts, like Fath al-Basair, the opening of insight, or the opening of the seers, or the opening of vision. There's a lot of different ways we can translate it. In that text, Shehu is talking about the role of the teacher in terms of knowledge, and how is it that we should look at knowledge. And so one of the things that is done is that he quotes from Imam al-Suyuti, and here in the notes, that part is included. Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio said in Fath al-Basair, the science of Tawheed, Ilm al-Tawheed, is divided into two divisions, ila qismain. Usul al-Din is one side, that's the first division, and that's foundational. The principles of Deen, and here when we talk about Deen, we're talking about the realities of Aqidah. And secondly, Deen has, before I go into that, Deen has a much more expansive meaning sometimes, and you find that in Hadith Jibril. It can mean the whole of the Deen, encompassing belief and practice, and at times it can just mean the foundational beliefs. More common is that it means the whole of the Deen, beliefs and practice, and included in that is our character as well. But here it means usul of the Deen, because you're attaching to the Deen, the word Deen, usul al-Deen, talking about the foundations of the Deen, and the foundation of the Deen is Tawheed. And we know that Iman, it has certain cornerstones, and we see those cornerstones mentioned in the Hadith of Jibreel. So that's the foundational side that everyone has to know, what we call usul al-Din. Everyone has to know that at the individual level. Ilm al-Kalam is not considered an obligation on everyone. The details of Aqidah, the arguments to clarify certain points, the refutations, all of that is not a universal obligation on the people to know. He says, as for the foundations of the Deen, it is a part of the individual obligations. Furud al-Ayyan. I mentioned this before, but I'm going over it again. Wa ilm al-Kalam is a part of the collective obligations. This is the confusion that we have in today's time. The additional point is that Imam al-Suyuti is quoted as having distinguished this reality. Usul al-Din people, the principles of the Deen, Ilm al-Kalam, Aqidah, especially for the non-Athari approach, you find in what some call the traditional approach in the later day to knowledge. The traditional approach to knowledge, let's say that. Those words, Usul al-Din, Ilm al-Kalam, Aqidah, Ilm al-Tawheed, all of those are synonymous. But in actuality, we get from Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio, and we get from Suyuti, Imam al-Suyuti rahmatullahi alayhi, we get a nuanced understanding that's very important for education. And I mentioned this a number of times, and I mentioned it again because of the chaotic atmosphere that we live in Aqidah. So one of the things that comes up is that Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi says, I say in success is what Allah realize, know, understand, come to know that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, or Allah Ta'ala, has established all of the foundations of the Deen in the mighty Quran. The Ilahiyat, the Nubuwat, the Sami'iyat. The issue that comes up here, these terms, Ilahiyat, Nubuwat, Sami'iyat, which are usually associated with Ilm al-Kalam, they're utilized by the Mu'tazila, they're utilized by the Ashari, they're utilized by the Maturidi, they're utilized by the Shi'i. These terms are not terms that are necessarily founded in the Quran and the Sunnah. They're mustalahat, or terminology, that is developed by the ulama to talk about Islamic belief or approaches to Islamic belief in a very systematic way. Okay? That's extremely important. In a very systematic way that people can understand even if they don't follow Quran and Sunnah. Sheikh Uthman then Fodi, one of the things that he does is he immediately brings into the equation this concept that usul ad-din, or the foundations of the deen, we can reference the Quran for that and don't have to follow the pathway of the scholars of Aqidah that are utilizing the principles and tools of ilm al-kalam, because the task of the scholar that is dealing with Aqidah in that way is different than the task that we're aiming for here. And the task that we're aiming for here is to understand what is an obligation upon us to know as individuals, so that we're clear on what's essential for being a Muslim above the reality of the Shahada. Above the reality of the Shahada. Last time we talked in the other session, we mentioned that the minimum that's needed for being classified as a Muslim in this world is the testification of the faith, the verbalization of the Shahada, according to the majority of the scholars. And we mentioned that some of the scholars, a minority of them, and you find this with the Hanbalis, but not only with the Hanbalis, but the position is attributed to some of them, that if a person were to be seen making salah, but they were not seen testifying to the faith, they could be a new Muslim or otherwise, then they're counted among the Muslims. And the logic there is that internally within the salah is the Shahada, it's the testimony of faith. That's very logical, that's very grounded as a position. This is important because among the scholars, there was a heavy debate. And I want to read this to you from the commentary of Al-Qalawi on Ibn Ashir, and it's translated in English as Islam in the School of Medina, right? It's translated as Islam in the School of Medina. Firstly, he reiterates the same thing that was reiterated by Sha'rani before, who talked about what's essential in Aqidah, and the same thing with Suyuti. Here it states from Imam Ahmed Zarruq, the great reformer. He was a great Maliki scholar. He was a reformer who reformed the practices in Tasawwuf that were problematic. He was a person that wrote on the problem of bid'ah, or the problem of deviation, and the problem of accretions that were unfounded in certain practices and beliefs and understandings among some of the Sufis. Firstly, he says that Iman is attesting to what has to be attested to. Meaning, to commit ourselves with certainty to the basics of belief, and in this case, that Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is one, and that the messenger of Allah is Muhammad. And he says, irrespective of whether that's done by way of taqleed or whether that is done by way of ijtihad, that's a detailed discussion. It's pointing to a detailed discussion. Is the belief of a person who doesn't know rational proofs for his or her aqidah, is it sound or not sound? There was a group of scholars among the Asharis, but not only the Asharis, but especially among the Asharis, they had debated this, and this type of discussion really was originated with the Mu'tazila. That discussion led to the point of saying that a person who doesn't know rational proofs for their belief is following, I hate to use the term in this way, but it kind of gets home, it's following blindly somewhat, without clear understanding. Is following and to be more polite, is trusting someone with regard to their beliefs, trusting what they're telling them about beliefs. Some of the scholars, they had argued that this is not a sound belief, and that the person had to commit themselves to understand rationally what are the foundations of belief, and to be able to prove rationally with rational proofs what their positions are in Aqidah. This is the approach of the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam. Among themselves, they began to debate. That's why I mentioned before that the testimony of faith is enough for a person to come into Islam. Because the question always comes up, what is the first obligation upon the Muslim? And so part of why there's such a heated debate in the Aqidah studies world across the different groups is because at one time there was this position that was put out that you had to learn the proofs, philosophical proofs for who Allah is, and to prove the existence of Allah, and to prove the non-eternity of the world. Not everyone is going to incline in that direction, and not everyone can easily take that approach. And so that's why among the scholars they debated. And so the general position became that that group, even though it was among the Asharis themselves or among any other school of Kalam, that their position is not to be taken, that a person's faith is sound as long as they testify the two testifications, which is the Shahadatain, which is to declare Allah to be one, free of partners, and that Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, is the last messenger and the last prophet. Here it says that if a person is imitating someone, as long as that person is a person of knowledge, and that person doesn't change their belief, and that person is on a sound foundation of belief, then if you're imitating that person, your teacher in that sense, then your belief is correct. Sheikh Zarruq also says, expertise in matters of Aqidah is not necessary, in other words, to go into the details, but rather knowledge of the principles of Usul al-Din. And this is the same thing that Sheikh Uthman, that Fodio, put forward. Imam al-Ghazali, he says, Rahmatullahi alayhi, the ordinary people or the general public, they're harmed by inner truths just as the dung beetle is harmed by rosewater and musk. The Prophet ﷺ said, speak to the people in the language they understand, or address them according to their understanding. Do you want them to deny Allah and His Messenger? He also said, ﷺ, I have been commanded to address the people in accordance with the capacity of their intellects. Here ends the words. The debate came up with regard to what is the first obligation, and I pointed that to of the Muslim. Is it to learn to engage in knowledge, or is it to uh, engage in reflective thought, inquiry, right? They call it. And so most of the scholars, they said that it was sufficient, and they're the vast majority, for the person just to know the basic meanings of Tawheed and testify. And the obligation to go deeper and to philosophize on Aqidah and so on and so forth. The great Sheikh Abu Muhammad ibn Abi Jamrah, who was a scholar of Hadith and also a reformer in Tasawwuf, he was from the Maliki school. He transmitted from another great scholar of Usul al-Fiqh and Hadith from Al-Andalus, whose name is Abu al-Walid al-Baji. And al-Baji, rahmatullahi alayhi, he transmitted from Abu Jafar Sam'ani, who is known to be one of the leading Asharis. And al-Baji heard him say, this is one of the matters of the Mu'tazila which has remained in the madhab, and there is only Allah exalted is He upon whom one can call upon for help. In other words, this debate about what course to take in Aqidah, do we have to take the path of ilm al-kalam and go deep into it, whether a person's iman is invalid if they don't engage in learning philosophically their Aqidah or not. That is one of the remnants of the Mu'tazili approach that has impacted the Sunnis, and it's a survival among the scholars of Kalam, some of the Asharis and others. And so the scholars didn't like that. And so although at times when you read in the books of Ilm al-Kalam, they start off with that awwal al-wajib huwa an-nadhr, that the first obligation upon the Muslim is to learn reflective, rational proofs in the way of the scholars of Kalam. That's not, even though that's put as the default position, that really is a matter for people of scholarship, and that people that are focusing on studying belief in such a way that they can understand how Islamic belief relates to other aqidas or other systems of belief, how it relates to philosophy, so on and so forth. The general public, was sufficient is the shahada and the usul of the deen. And so then here Sheikh Uthman then Fodio begins with this point: I say in successes with Allah, realize that Allah has established all of the foundations of the deen in the mighty Quran. He's changing the direction. So he's saying the first obligation is to know what the Quran is telling us about who Allah is, because the Quran is the speech of Allah, versus saying the first obligation is for you to reflect and learn philosophical proofs in ilm al-kalam to tell us who Allah is, what's impossible for Allah, what's possible for Allah, what's necessary for Allah in terms of Allah's names and attributes. Sheikh Uthman al-Fodio puts the Quran as the center, even though he's using the terminology that's used in ilm al-kalam, ilahiyat, al-nubuwat, and al-sam'iyat. The reality of the situation is that he's centralizing the Quran. And even Dr. Nasr al-Aql, who's one of the more intellectual Salafi scholars in terms of, he has some pretty worked out arguments on some things. He talked about the term ilahiyat and sam'iyat, and he said ilahiyat, people, is that which discusses that body of knowledge that discusses the qualities of Allah. Islamiyat is basically saying that there's a body of knowledge which it comes by way of transmission. We listen to it. It comes by way of the prophets. Alayhimussalam. That knowledge doesn't come by way of intellect, neither by way of personal inspiration, but it's transmitted to us by way of the prophets. And most of that has to do with realities of the unseen, like the Day of Judgment, receiving of the books, the traveling over the Sirat, the existence of angels. Those types of things are knowledge that comes to us, that we call it or describe it as knowledge of the unseen, but it comes to us by way of transmission. Dr. Nasser al-Aql said, as if we're clear on what ilahiyat means and sam'iyat means, then there's no real issue in the utilization of these terms as long as we're clear on what they mean. So here you even see kind of like a common ground between even the Salafi approach and Aqidah, the Ash'ari and the Maturidi approach, and even we can say even the Mu'tazila in that regard. The ulama generally don't become too combative over terminology as long as the terminology is clarified, because terminology sometimes can take on multiple meanings. So that's why terminology is important, but we need to be clear on how we're using terminology in order if we're going to be systematic. So that's the first take, that Sheikh Uthman then Fodio is saying that the first obligation then is to know that the foundations of the deen, in terms of usul al-deen, in terms of the foundations of Aqidah, the principles of Aqidah, they're found in the Quran. Moving on. So when it comes to the ilahiyat, or that which pertains to understanding who Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is, here in the note it says this is the knowledge of what is necessary with regard to the rights of Allah, what is impossible with regard to who Allah is, and what's permissible from that take, that approach, that detail that came from Muhammad Sharif, that adds another dimension. Sheikh Uthman Danfodi in Umdat al-Bayan, which is translated, and the cornerstone of clarification, he has somewhat of a tendency which is dealing with kind of a traditional approach at the later day scholars had. So on some of these issues, he's dealing with like kind of like the terminology of scholars of Kalam. He's pretty much summarizing the way that things are done in other books of tradition. But he himself here is moving away from that approach and is not locking us into ilm al-kalam, is not locking us into a madhab 100%. Although you find that in his writings that he has a space for that. But here he wants to create a neutral ground in this text. And that's why, for instance, even it says in the beginning of the affair, in the note for the section on ilm usul al-din, the note is number 19, and all the way towards the midway point, it says, in the beginning of the affair, Shehu, he attributed his doctrine of Aqidah to the Ash'ari school. However, after he attained spiritual stations of the complete pole, and he became a scholar of Ijtihad and a scholar of reform, he took his Aqidah directly from the Quran. This was his methodology and that of his disciples, whose transmission from him, who have transmission from him as well. So then he quotes Sheikh Abdul Qadir ibn Mustafa in the book Al-Uhud al-Muwathiq, Al-Uhud wal-Muwathiq, sorry. I have taken it, and it says, I have taken an oath in covenant to build my Aqidah upon the ayat of the Quran and not upon the rational proofs of the scholars of ilm al-kalam or the theological theories. Right? And so here in this text, we have to realize that the Sheikh, he's doing that work. He's showing us the importance of being extremely nuanced when we deal with knowledge. and knowing the role of each body of knowledge, not just to come into knowledge and just flow with knowledge the way that is being taught. That so this is really the role of the teacher. The teacher has to know how to explain to the student the purposes of knowledge and what we call al-mabadi al-ashra, or the 10 foundational principles to understand. It's a framework for understanding every science. Among those, there's actually a book that was translated that deals with these 10 foundational concepts for every major science. It's translated into English by one of the brothers from Europe, who's actually very available online. His name is Harun. The 10 foundational principles when it comes to understanding the science, the science of Aqidah or the science of Ilm al-Kalam or whatever it may be, we have to understand what are the purposes of the sciences. And that's one of the reasons why Shehu Uthman then Fodio comes in immediately and he clarifies for the student of knowledge. Aqidah, or the science of Tawheed, is broken up into two. That which is an individual obligation, that which is a collective obligation. When we come back to the issue of the utilization of the term ilahiyat, immediately Shehu is going into the whole concept of sorry, I had some notes that I put it in the Arabic, that's why, sorry. Shehu is going into the concept immediately of showing who Allah is, and he's doing a parallel between some terminology that's used in Ilm al-Kalam, but he's showing who Allah is in terms of the Quran. So the first thing that's brought up is that Allah Ta'ala has established the creation. Let me go to the Arabic on this, because I was doing some work in the Arabic and it's a little more flowing actually. So here, Ilm Usul al-Din is the foundations of belief as opposed to the foundations of action, which the foundations of action, you can say that it's fiqh, the principles of fiqh, right? The principles of fiqh. And so then that has a discussion to it, and it'll come in its time. So remember that the Shehu is using the three categorization system. Usul al-Din, outward knowledge, inward knowledge. Outward knowledge here is all of fiqh. Inward knowledge has to do with the life of the heart and intention and the spiritual state of the person. He's following this methodology. So here, the foundations of the deen are our belief in Allah. So the first thing that comes up, which is a very important concept for the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, is to know that the world is created. So the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, they go into like extremely detailed arguments for this stuff. Shehu, he's saying we're going to go with the Quran. That argumentative approach has its place in its time, with philosophical approach if it's needed. But what's foundational is to know what Revelation says. So here the Quran says, with regard to ithbat huduth al-alam, or with establishing that the world is not eternal, that the universe itself, or all of the creation, we should say, al-alam, like al-alamin, rabbul alamin, al-alam, everything that is in existence is created except Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And so he quotes an ayat from the Quran, which is in Surah Al-Rum, and that ayat from the Quran is huwa alladhi yabda'u al-khalqa thumma yu'iduh. He's the one that initiates the creation and then renews it. We see that in the movement of the seasons. So within the natural order, and this is one of the things that he talked about, Sheikh Dan Fodio, uh, he he talked about the perfection of faith, or the perfection of Iman, comes in reflecting on the creation versus reflecting on rational proofs, reflect on the creation. So one of the Quranic concepts is this issue of renewal, which we're experiencing right now in this part of the world that we're in. In Australia, you see a different season. In Australia, is cold, it's winter. Here's summer. And so you see in the reality of the creation itself that the creation, because remember that we're dealing with the reality that is important to understand when it comes to knowledge. We have the book of Revelation, which is the Quran, and the clarification of the Quran is the Sunnah, along with the Arabic language. And we have the book of creation, the book of creation. And included in the book of creation is the universe and the human being. And the human being is supposed to be like the pinnacle of creation and a reflection of the reality of the universe. That's in Islamic thinking. When we talk about the universe is a book to be reflected on, just like the Quran is to be reflected on. And the Quran refers to the universe, refers to the natural order, refers to us as human beings, and talks about the signs in the horizons and within ourselves, the ayat. And so within ourselves is ayat, signs of Allah, and within the creation are signs of Allah. Unfortunately, sometimes that's missing in the reflection of the scholars of Kalam. And sometimes that's taken up among some of the Sufi scholars, but sometimes they get so philosophical that it becomes, they get into problematic theories. So the Shehu wants to keep that at a lower level, not take that into the problematic area. Reflect. The Quran talks to us about the life and death, the reality of life and death. And the Quran shows us that reality of life and death in the creation is around us. We see it. So that's the first proof, right? That's the first proof that he brings to the table. The foundational proof is that Allah has created, has established, or we established the creation of the universe. And the words, and he is the one who initiates or begins the creation and renews it, or brings it back to life. And that process of renewal is an important process to reflect upon, right? That's happening with regularity. Another concept that he brings up is a very philosophical concept. It was borrowed by people like Ibn Sina, from people like Ibn Sina, and then it was brought into Ilm al-Kalam. And that's the idea that what is established is that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is wajib al-wujud, right? Wajib al-wujud, it means that existence which is absolutely necessary, which is independent. Everything else that's in the creation is depending on Allah. And he comes up with the idea that Allah is independent as well from the Quran itself. And we see that in the attribute that Allah is Al-Ghani. Al-Ghani is usually translated as Allah is self-sufficient, rich. And rich in the sense that not in need, self-sufficient, not in need as well. And so here, Shehu is taking us from Ilm al-Kalam to the Quran. So the idea that Allah is wajib al-wujud, which is a concept that you find in Ilm al-Kalam, you say, hold on a second, we can find that right in the Quran. And the English reads that He Allah Ta'ala has established that his existence is absolutely necessary, wajib al-wujud, by his words. That is because Allah, he is the real. He is the real. Now, when you look, for instance, this is in Surah Al-Hajj, the 6th ayat, sorry. Imam Al-Qurtubi, Imam Al-Qurtubi says in his tafsir that he mentions here the poverty of all of what is in creation and its need. Everything that's in creation is need upon Allah. ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْحَقِّ. And it's important because it's like Shehu here is bringing up the Quran to talk about points in Aqidah, but sometimes the relationship between what he's saying from the side of Ilm al-Kalam when he's talking about Wajib al-Wujud and the ayah of the Quran is not so clear. But the relationship between the two, the principle of Ilm al-Kalam and how the proof that he's bringing from the Quran to show that these ideas that are foundational and belief, they're in the Quran itself. They're not they're not to be considered ilm al-kalam, but they're to be considered usul al-din. I call them ilm al-kalam to know so that the people, the student of knowledge knows that look, usul al-din, which is attributed to ilm al-kalam, we mentioned that Shehu, he has his own understanding of usul al-din along with Suyuti, that's foundational knowledge upon the individual. And he's saying that this knowledge is in the Quran. We don't have to go to the theories of the scholars of ilm al-kalam. So sometimes the rabit, or the connecting point between the idea that he's bringing, that he's mentioning, that he's referring, well, this is ilm al-kalam, but we can find the foundation over here in the Quran. Sometimes it's not clear. So when we look at the tafsir shows us, Al-Qurtubi is teaching us that, look, actually the meaning of the ayah is exactly as Sheikh was saying. When we think deeper, that when it says that ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْحَقِّ, right? That indeed Allah is the real, right? That is because Allah, He is the real, is the other translation of it. What it implies is that everything is dependent upon Allah. What it implies is that everything is dependent upon Allah, and that we can get that meaning based on Al-Qurtubi. Based on Al-Qurtubi. The other ayat that comes in, is the ayah that deals with the concept of Al-Qadim. Al-Qadim is a debated term. Even within the Salafi discourse, it has been debated because it means pretty much the ancient, so to speak. It means the ancient is not an attribute of Allah per se in terms of a word or a name, in terms of being a name, but in meaning is found in the Quran. And here he says that the existence of Allah has been established to be before time by the word al-Qadim. And the ayah of the Quran that's a proof for that is Huwa al-Awwal. He's the first, but not first in a sequential manner. Not that there's something else that follows. He's the first, meaning that He is, and that's it. You know what I'm saying? He's the one that creates, and that's it. There's no partner with Him. And so here, one of the interesting things that I found is that Imam Abu Hayyan, in this in his tafsir for this ayah of the Quran from Surah Al-Hadid, the third ayah, he says, لَيْسَ لِوُجُودِهِ بِدَايَةٌ مُفْتَتَحَةٌ, that the existence of Allah has nothing that came prior to it, so that we're thinking about Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala from the terminology of beginning and end and so on and so forth, as the way that human beings have a birth and human beings have a death. That doesn't exist for Allah. And that's a beautiful reflection. You know what I'm saying? So Imam Abu Hayyan al-Andalusi brings that reality out. And the ayat that follows is that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala athbata kawnahu baqiyan, right? بقوله تعالى توكل على الحي الذي لا يموت. The one who clarifies the relationship between this idea of Allah being al-Baqi, And the ayah itself is Imam Ibn Kathir. And actually in the commentary note, the idea is brought out, but reference to Ibn Kathir is not mentioned. Imam Ibn Kathir, he says, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, this part, when I say Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, is from me, but he says, Ad-Daim al-Baqi, is Sarmardi. So Imam Ibn Kathir uses the term al-Baqi, which is exactly what Sheikh Uthman then Fodio referred to. And that is that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala's existence is established as being continuous. Allah remains. And the ayah of the Quran, and rely upon the living who will never die. And the commentators on the Quran come about when they talk about the concept of tawakkul, which Imam al-Ghazali puts tawakkul, he pairs it up with tawheed. And it's very similar to Iyaka na'budu wa Iyaka nasta'in. Who can we have tawakkul on any living thing that comes to an end? Can we really rely on any living thing which comes to an end with a unrestricted reliance? We can't. That thing that we rely on may come to an end. It has its limitations. And so we rely on Allah. So here the Quran is commanding and rely upon the living who will never die. Who will never die. And then we go into the idea that Allah is unlike the creation. That Allah is unlike the creation. And that is established in the ayah of the Quran, Laysa kamithlihi shay. And there's an emphasis that's put that there's no comparison between Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala and anything. The Quran is emphasizing that idea of comparison with the creation. Say, there's nothing in the creation that is like Allah. And that's where the debates in Aqidah come in when it comes to certain attributes. Like for instance, that Allah has a face, that Allah has a hand, those types of things. This principle is brought out by the Athari group and is brought out by the scholars of Kalam, that Allah is unlike anything, this Quranic principle. And some, they go to the point of saying whatever is there in the Arabic, if it says that Allah has a hand, the meaning is completely different. And some say no, the meaning, we establish it, we know what it means in the Arabic language, but the how of it is what we do tafweed of, or the how of it is what we surrender. The how of it is what we say. We don't know the how, because there's nothing in comparison to Allah. No one has the ability to say they have seen Allah. We have the idea of speaking to Allah as foundation on the Quran. We have the idea of seeing Allah in the hereafter as foundational in Aqidah. This comes up in Aqidah Tahawiyah. Is the difference between the Sunnis and the Mu'tazila, that we will see Allah. But when it comes to our reality on the earth, the creation points to who Allah is, and revelation or the Quran clarifies to us who Allah is and clarifies to us how we understand the creation. And so the idea of similitude, that's where the Muslims, they differ among each other with the issue of metaphor, with the issue of what we call tanzih, or the issue of the eminence of God, right? That's an important concept, that how God is unlike anything, but it's a matter of difference of opinion amongst the major groups within the Sunnis. So you have one group that says we have to interpret these ayat to follow this principle, Laysa kamithlihi shay, that Allah is unlike the creation. And we mentioned that the ayah is super emphasizing this point, that there's nothing similar to Allah. But we have ayat of the Quran that are utilizing things that are similar to us in our understanding especially like the idea of hand. Those things, we know what hand is in language, we know what is in our reality. But the ayah of the Quran says, like, yes, we know the word hand, but this ayah, when we bring it together, this hand can't be compared to what Allah is describing. And so that's where the Muslims begin to debate among themselves. And I don't want to get into that right now, but the most important principle to know is that Allah is unlike the creation. There's nothing in the created order that is equivalent to Allah. Everything is pointing to who Allah is, and the Quran clarifies, right? And then we have in Surah Al-Ikhlas the clarification that Allah is one, that Allah is not born or doesn't give birth in the way that the creation does, especially human beings. And so that is a very technical point. But the principle that Allah Ta'ala is different than the creation is important. And then we follow that up with that is established that Allah is Al-Ghani. We talked about that already. The Quran openly says that Allah is Ghani, right? And then Imam al-Tabari says that Allah is independent, or Al-Ghani an Khalqi. Allah is not in need of the creation the way that the creation is in need of God. That's why we say Allah is the creator. And then at the end is established that Allah is one, which is a little different than the first. Is established in Qul Huwa Allahu Ahad, right? That Allah is one. And we're gonna stop there due to the fact of hitting an hour mark. But the idea here is that Allah Ta'ala stands alone, and again it brings back the whole idea of the independence of Allah Ta'ala, and it brings up the idea that Allah is self-sufficient, and it's almost as though the way that Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio ordered these principles, I should say, versus ideas, is he ordered these principles in such a way that we understand subtle points of Tawheed from the Quran without having to go into a lot of debate, right? That's extremely important. Extremely important. There's nuances that come up in the Arabic language, schools of thought, and so on and so forth when it comes to the Asma'i wa Sifat, and we don't want to get into that at this time. That's not the purpose of this type of text. It's necessary to understand, but we have to realize, firstly, there's some foundational common ground beliefs that we as Muslims, regardless of group, we all believe in. Then the details on some points of these details, which they're important, that's where we differ, especially how we're dealing with the names and the attributes of Allah. But there's, up to this point, everything that has been said, whether Ashari or whether Maturidi or whether Salafi, no one differs on that point. No one differs on any of this stuff that was said. It's all overlapping, all common ground. You know what I'm saying? And that's what I like about the way that he wrote, and that's what is extremely beneficial, you know what I'm saying, in his teachings. And so what remains is about 7 attributes of Allah Ta'ala, and then we go into the idea of prophethood or nubuwwah or nubuwwat. And I want you to reflect on these concepts that we put forward in terms of education. Why is it that he's establishing the idea of usul ad-din? What is it that he did with regard to the Quran? Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio in this text, is he centralizing the Quran first? What is it that he does with regard to the first obligation You're saying that the first obligation is to do what? To know the Quran, or is it to reflect on philosophical proofs? That is a major point that you have to be clear on, so that you can understand some of the debates in Aqidah, so that you can understand what's essential for you when you teach people. How do you teach? How do you understand yourself? You see what I'm saying? That's very key in what he's doing there. Who was it that I mentioned that along with Sheikh Uthman and Fodio, I mentioned two people. Who was it that brought in? I actually mentioned three people, but 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 two of them is sufficient for me. Uh, who was it that separated out the idea of Aqidah being divided into two divisions? Usul al-Din and Ilm al-Kalam is saying that Usul al-Din is an individual obligation, whereas Ilm al-Kalam is a collective obligation. The other thing that you should be clear on is this idea that he says that the Usul al-Din is established in the Quran itself. Right? That I'm telling you. See, I say in Successes with Allah, realize, and that point, realize, is usually they start off, you find this in the books of Ilm al-Kalam, and you find it in Usul al-Thalatha by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. The first obligation on the Muslim is to know or to reflect. So here he's following the idea to know, but he's saying he's using a proof of the Quran. And one of the reasons, I didn't mention this before, but one of the reasons why he's using the Quran is because the Quran is mutawatir. So the proof of the Quran is ultimate certainty. Sheikh Uthman and Fodio is not that easy to deal with. The scholars of Ilm Kalam are saying that the proofs of Aqidah have to be certain. La ibrata bidhan, as they say. You find this in Sharh al-Aqaid and other books of Ilm al-Kalam. They say that there's no consideration given to proofs that are not reaching the level of certitude that we consider proofs of certitude. And I extended that out in translation intentionally. Certainty for them is achieved by rational proofs. Then they say by mutawatir narrations and so on and so forth. But Sheikh Uthman and Fodio says, hold on a second. Certainty is established by what comes in revelation. Prophethood brings what is certain first. Intellect, we differ. We differ in level of understanding. And that's the major difference between Sheikh Uthman and Fodio and some scholars of Ilm al-Kalam, and what's popularly trending in Ilm al-Kalam, that they put so much emphasis on rational proofs that they forget that the rational proofs were supposed to be there to defend Iman, not to override Iman with philosophy. You know what I'm saying? And that's just Imam al-Ghazali himself. He corrects the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam for that excess that they have taken. You know what I'm saying? So that's important to take a key note for. The other issue is the idea of the other question. What bayah or what commitment was mentioned by one of the students of Sheikh Uthman and Fodio? What commitment did that person make with regard to studying Aqidah? To base their Aqidah on what versus what? That's important for understanding the text. You have to be able to understand that. I mentioned wajib al-wujud. That's very important for your studies in Ilm al-Kalam in the future. Why is it that that term is used? And I mentioned it indirectly. I also mentioned the term al-qadim. That's another key idea in Ilm al-Kalam. How is it that Sheikh Uthman and Fodio works with that? He uses what ayah of the Quran? That I expect you to know. What ayah of the Quran? Because that, you see sometimes in the Salafi approach, they debate on that point.